ARRIRAW Sucks. All right, here we are, another video, trying to stay hip with the times. Let's talk about it. Alexa 35 Xtreme. This is a pretty interesting announcement from ARRI today, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen. Dropping the new Xtreme model of their flagship camera. Of course, the nomenclature of Xtreme is a throwback to the 435 Xtreme, which was kind of their, at the time, high-speed flagship 35mm camera. That's one little detail that I kind of think is cool as somebody who appreciates filmmaking history. It's like, it's cool to throw back to the time before or the previous era of filmmaking. So personally, I think the name is kind of cool. I wish that they made the logo a little cooler looking, slash maybe made it smaller, slash maybe put it somewhere else on the camera body, but here we are. All right, let's pull up some specs. Alexa 35 Xtreme. They announced it today. This is interesting for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, because ARRI is offering a hardware upgrade path for an existing camera to the latest spec'd out version. This is something that Red has classically done over the years. I think Sony's done it on a few different cameras. I believe that some of the early Alexa models had some upgradability, but typically, at least in the last like 6-8 years, that's not something that ARRI has really been about. So it's interesting to see them do that. The whole price point is also just interesting to me because it's basically the same price as the original Alexa 35 was when it shipped. And, you know, which is sort of true and sort of not true, because when the Alexa 35 was announced, you could buy the production set for like $77,000. And then there was a huge wait list. People didn't get their camera for years. And in that time, because supply was low and demand was high, they jacked the price up to $86,000 or $87,000. So now the Alexa 35 Xtreme is the same price as that kind of marked up original Alexa 35. So what's interesting is there's some people that bought the Alexa 35 at the new full price, and now to upgrade to the Alexa 35 Xtreme, they now have to pay $18,000 some odd dollars to basically get the new top of the line functionality. When they paid full price for this camera, in some cases, less than a year ago or less than 2 years ago, which to me just feels a little silly. It feels a little bit like a slap in the face to owner ops who did pay full price. There's some people who did get the Alexa 35 for the original price, which was, you know, $77,000. So it's a little bit of a wash, but still, even those people are having to pay $10,000 above list price to get their camera unlocked to the new full functionality. That personally leaves a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth, and you might have a different opinion, but I also do know that ARRI has the best QC and the best process for making sure that their gear is ready to handle any scenario. So that is one thing that I do know that you're getting is when you're going to send one of your cameras in, especially to get it upgraded, it's like they're going to pay attention to every single detail. So that's something you're not worrying about. That's why ARRI cameras last longer than pretty much any other camera out there. And that's why cameras like the Alexa Mini and even the Alexa Classic are still kicking, you know, almost 15 years later for some of these cameras. So the other thing that's interesting to me is their new codec, which is called ARRICORE. If you've shot RAW on ARRI cameras, you know how much of a pain in the ass it is. ARRIRAW sucks. The files are huge. You get little to no card space, especially if you're shooting on something like an Alexa Mini or an Amira. And it's an absolutely beastly codec to try and edit. Like, it's the least efficient, least optimized codec, raw codec out there, in my opinion. It seems like their ARRICORE format is something that is akin to something like Blackmagic RAW, which is not a true RAW, like a Bayer RAW format. This is an RGB format. And to me, what I would classify that as is lossy RAW, that you can basically encode and decode in camera straight onto your media. And there's a whole bunch of science behind it that I don't really know 100% about, but it seems like the quality is still very high, but you're getting smaller file sizes and increased flexibility overall. Of course, I haven't downloaded any ARRICORE footage, so I don't really know what that's like in real life, but I think that's super interesting. So we got the new codec, which is cool, and then of course the new codec is part of what allows the new high frame rate options, which is, you know, what pertains to the classic Xtreme nomenclature from the 435 Xtreme. We've got this new sensor overdrive mode, which we'll talk about in a minute, but in full quality, you know, ProRes or ARRICORE, you can get up to 120 frames per second in OpenGate, which is pretty insane. You can get up to 150 frames per second in 4K, UHD, which is not the full sensor, but you're basically punching in just a little bit. And then if you go all the way down to 2K 16:9, you can get 330 frames per second, which is insane. I mean, that's crazy. Like, part of the reason that I love the Alexa Mini so much is because of that 2K 200 frames per second mode. And of course, that's not getting used on every single project, but when you do want some high frame rate stuff, it is awesome. And particularly what I love about the Mini is that you can shoot the full sensor, at least the full Super 35 16:9 portion of the sensor, up to 200 frames per second, which is just sick. So this is a little different on the Alexa 35 Xtreme. You're punching into Super 16, you know, so everything comes with a trade-off, obviously, but still Super 16 mode on the Alexa 35 is awesome. And being able to go up to those kind of frame rates is pretty incredible. Now we have the whole sensor overdrive mode, which I have mixed feelings about. And it's interesting to me that they chose to, you know, really tout this 660 frames per second kind of number, because there should be so many asterisks beside it, because it's like, it's only in Super 16 mode, it's only in sensor overdrive mode, which not only gives you bad readout speeds, but gives you limited dynamic range, particularly in the highlights. I do see some real use cases for this mode, like when you're in a very controlled environment in a studio shooting, you know, high-speed food stuff, or you're on a motion control, you know, robot, and you're doing some high-speed stuff. Like, that makes sense to me. But if I'm just ripping around doing a normal project where I'm going to be shooting in sunlight, or, you know, even in controlled lighting, but, you know, I'm trying to max out the highlight performance of a sensor like the LUB4, the fact that I'm going to basically chop my 17 stops of dynamic range down to 11 or 12, I don't know how I feel about it. I'll have to get my hands on the camera and actually use the functionality to kind of, you know, see what it's like in the real world. But it's cool to have as an option, and of course it's not going to work on every single project, but it's pretty wild to have an Alexa camera that will go above 500 frames per second. I mean, typically that's been something that's been reserved for a Phantom or something like the Ember, or other high-speed cameras. And so to be able to have one camera that can sort of do it all is kind of cool. What's interesting to me about the sensor overdrive mode is that in OpenGate, you don't get that much of a bump in frame rate performance. You go from 120 FPS to 165 FPS. That doesn't feel like a big enough jump for me personally to sacrifice the readout speeds and the dynamic range performance that you're gonna lose by being in the sensor overdrive mode. Now, when you get into 3.8K 16:9 and the 2K Super 16 modes, you get big bumps in performance. So regular, just standard ProRes mode, you get up to 150 frames per second in 3.8K 16:9. In sensor overdrive mode, you get 240 frames per second. In 3.8K 239:1 mode, you get 240 frames per second, and you'd get actually zero bump in sensor overdrive mode. So like, if that's the format that you're choosing, I like have no idea why you would want to shoot in sensor overdrive mode for that. And then you get a big jump in Super 16 mode. You go from 330 frames per second to 660. So you literally get, you know, double the frame rate, which is kind of insane. It seems to me like you couldn't really just flip the camera into sensor overdrive mode and just operate as normal. I believe the base ISO actually changes from 800 to 1600 to kind of give a little bit more highlight performance. But I would assume that a lot of the reason that a lot of people and a lot of productions are choosing the Alexa 35 is for its unmatched highlight performance. Like, you get 6 stops in the highlights, which is just insane. And people say there are other cameras that can do it. And it's like, yes, you know, the V-Raptor X has, you know, that dual gain mode where you can get the extended highlight performance, but it comes at a cost. You're not getting the actual full quality that the camera can provide in terms of like you can on the Alexa 35. Overall, I have mixed feelings about this upgrade. I think the people who are getting the worst end of this whole bargain is people who have recently bought the Alexa 35 base model, because now for basically the same price, they're offering the Alexa 35 Xtreme in base model. And then you can basically unlock functionality of the camera with licenses, which I also have mixed feelings about. It seems dumb to make super great hardware and then nerf that hardware with paywalls. But at the same time, not everybody can afford to drop $90,000 or $100,000 to get into a camera platform. So if you can, you know, cut 30% off of that cost to entry, somebody can get in and then upgrade as they need or get temporary licenses. For people who just bought the Alexa 35 base model that was announced like less than 6 months ago, this is a really interesting situation, because some of those people paid $54,000 for their Alexa 35 base. And now they could buy an Alexa 35 Xtreme base set for $57,000. So to me, it seems really weird. And personally, I'm like, okay, now that those people have the Alexa 35 base, can they upgrade to the Alexa 35 Xtreme? And do they have to pay the same $18,000 price to upgrade that the original Alexa 35 owners did? Because if that's the case, okay, you just paid $54,000 for a camera. The newer version of that camera now costs $57,000, which is only $3,000 more. And to upgrade it to have the upgrade path for the newest, latest, greatest frame rates, etc., you're gonna have to pay $18,000. So we're what, sitting in the mid 70s, and potentially you still don't have any licenses for that camera. Hello, come here. I love you. You want to be in my video? You say hi?
Hi.
That's a stream deck. Look, do you see mommy? Mommy's on the screen. So potentially somebody who paid for the Alexa 35 base to pay for the upgrade path is now having to pay mid 70s, which is what the original Alexa 35 was priced at. And now they've got this Alexa 35 Xtreme base model that doesn't have any licenses. That seems crazy to me. So maybe that's not going to be the case. Maybe ARRI will release more information about this kind of upgrade path option for people who bought the original Alexa 35 base model. I'm interested to see what that's going to look like, because to me right now it seems kind of whack. I'll be interested to see what rental rates for this camera look like. It's just a weird time in the market for expensive high-end gear. When the Alexa 35 actually shipped and finally got into people's hands, the few people that had them early on could rent them out for $2,000 plus a day. That was kind of a going rate. But I know a lot of owner ops who had struggled to get full rate for that camera, because cameras like the Mini LF and even the Alexa Mini are still very viable, and a lot of people couldn't justify double or double and a half of the cost of an Alexa Mini or an Alexa Mini LF, depending on where you're able to source it from. So I'm interested to see where the Xtreme is going to sit in the rental market. There's a couple other updates, like new and improved Wi-Fi connectivity, new antennas, and more pre-record times. The pre-record time is an interesting feature, and I feel like typically nature docs and wildlife cinematographers have not really trended towards using ARRI cameras because they're not super conducive for that type of work. But in some recording modes, you get up to 5 minutes of pre-record, which could be pretty insane for that type of work. So interested to see more nature stuff come out that looks really pretty because it's shot on Alexa 35. So that's probably going to be pretty dope. What else here? 10% lower power consumption. That's negligible. I mean, the Alexa 35 already sucks batteries like no other camera out there. So 10% is kind of negligible. If they were able to do something more like 30 or 40%, that could be cool. To me, 10% almost doesn't seem like enough of a jump to like really even market it. So yeah, the other thing that's interesting is if you wanted to get into the Alexa 35 Xtreme using the base model upgrade path, you're going to pay $57,000 for the base model with no licenses on it. If I was going to do that, I would go for the high-speed license and I would go for the open gate license. And then maybe the look license, but I feel like there are maybe some ways to get around that. If you were to add the high-speed license and the open gate / anamorphic license, you would be adding around $10,000 to $11,000 onto that 57. So you're looking at 67 kind of out the door for that base model kit and those two licenses. To me, that's kind of compelling as an owner operator, because it's like you can get a lot done inside of just those two licenses. You're spending, a significant amount less than if you just went, for the full Xtreme version of the camera with premium licenses already installed. I think that will be a good option for some people. It still is a bit interesting to me overall, the whole spread of Alexa cameras that are currently available now. So we'll see what it looks like in the future. Of course, I'm always going to be an ARRI fan. I do think that they make pretty much the best image out there. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.